Pumpkins. We have got a ton of pumpkins. Dream Farm is brought to you by Whitetail Institute. Research equals results. Hunt Stand Pro Whitetail app. Hoyt Archery. Wildlife Farming. And PH Outdoors. And this plot right here would be the poster child, if there was such a thing, for spots where we planted pumpkins around the outside of our food plot. I think we put 200. We put a little packet, a whole packet of pumpkins around the edge of this little plot. This was planted as sorghum and pumpkins around the edge. The whole idea there is that the pumpkins can kind of make their own way. They can vine in, they can vine out. If they do great, awesome. If they don't, too bad for them. You know, we're just giving them a chance because we know that the deer will eat them.
We learned that. Do you think you'll have to break them open again this year? Do you think? I
do. I think I will, because it's going to be a fresh batch of deer because we've put so many new areas of pumpkin.
Mm-hmm.
The spot, we only did one little spot last year. We had the drought. They did okay. There was probably 15 pumpkins at the most, 10 maybe. The deer ate them as soon as I broke one open. And you know, we thought, well, that's kind of a cool way to add maybe some extra forage to any food plot, is just to put a bunch of pumpkins around the edge of it and don't even try to manage them. So that's what we've done. And in this spot, they did awesome. This is just like I said, a sorghum plot. Tons of pumpkins around them, and they're vining everywhere. There's going to be 150 pumpkins here. It's kind of too bad it's right by the buildings, because I doubt they're going to get utilized nearly as much as they would if they were way back in the middle of nowhere.
We might have some world-class jack-o'-lanterns this fall.
We could line the whole driveway with, what do they call that, where they put like little lights along a walkway?
Photos?
We'll do that with pumpkins.
Okay.
We'll do jack-o'-lanterns up and down the driveway, but we'll have plenty of them. So that's kind of where the pumpkins fall in. We didn't do anything special. Like I said, we bought the Connecticut field pumpkins off Amazon, planted 4 to a mound, and that's what we got. Simple. You can add it easily to any food plot that you plant.
They don't seem like they're too picky about soil anything.
No, and you're already fertilizing those food plots anyway,
Yeah.
So it's kind of a win-win for the pumpkin and for the deer. Now we're on to the topic of sorghum. Every time I plant it, I like it better. And I think it's going to be a bigger part of what we do in the future, maybe every year. There's another way to plant this stuff, and maybe I can really bring it out in the conclusion of this episode is, you know, plant the sorghum on 30-inch rows. This was 22.5 is what we planted here. But lay down the soybeans first. Plant beans, and then plant the sorghum into the beans after the beans have had a chance to get up and get growing. Plant them as early as you can, because you can spray that with chemical and you can clean it up. And now the beans should be working to shade out other weed pressure, and then you could drill the sorghum into the beans. And you should get the sorghum to pop up through the beans, and then the 30-inch rows should give you enough sunlight to, you know, keep the beans going. I see that as maybe the magic formula long term, is my grain plots. You know, a little bit of corn here and there, but gosh, sorghum and beans, if the deer, especially if the deer embrace the beans as well as they did last year, or the sorghum, did I say beans?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorghum. They really like the sorghum from what we saw. So if that trend continues, I'm going to keep planting more and more.
Double layer food plot.
That's right. And then, you know, we talk about interseeding brassicas, and we'll come back around to that in another section of this episode too, but that potentially could be a third layer in some cases. We planted this in early June, and it's now early August. It's just getting ready to put heads out. So we should be plenty in time. In fact, I can see a couple of them if you look up, and they're starting to put the heads out. So these should do well. The timing should be good. Of course, the moisture really helped this year, but I don't see a downside with sorghum unless the deer just don't want it. Everything else about it is awesome because they don't eat it during the summer. You know, it's one of the few things you can plant that they like to eat in the fall that they don't eat in the summer.
Do you think it's pretty standard across the Midwest, the deer would respond similarly to it? Like, I know you planted it in southern Iowa and you had good results there, and now northeast Iowa, good results here. Would you say that that's pretty widespread, or are there regions where they wouldn't be as responsive to it?
I don't know, they might have to learn. They might have to learn to eat it in some places. I'm not 100% sure. I know that the deer in southern Iowa were always hungry. So they were going to eat anything that I planted that was, you know, halfway edible. Here, these deer are a lot pickier because they're not hungry. So the fact that they're eating it makes me think that it's actually something that's high on their list. They were walking through the corn last year to eat sorghum.
With the lower density, you can kind of almost do a study of what their actual preferences are when you take necessity out of the picture, because they have the choice. They can pick which things they want to eat because there's plenty of options. So it's kind of cool to see when they have multiple options what they gravitate towards.
Yeah, and they were eating sorghum. So like I said, we'll keep that on the list and maybe have another plan for, you know, how we grow it and how we manage it next year. So now we're going to talk about soybeans. Never thought I'd be saying this because we sure haven't seen it in the past. We've got beans all over the place. The only spots where we don't have much going for us on soybeans is up on the ridge. Just smaller patches, and there's just nothing else around there that's related to beans that the deer are just hammering it. I mean, everything's corn up on the ridge. You know, the tenant farmer put in corn, so all the beans that I planted, they just mowed them off. Whereas down here in the valley, and even on the bench, right above us to our left, and then the Scrape Tree Valley, just loaded up with beans. And they're browsing on them a little bit, but not a ton. Well, let me put it this way. We've got about 3 or 4 times too much food on the farm this year for the number of deer we've got. I mean, last year the acorns were the reason why we had too much food. And this year it's just going to be the growing season.
So what's the downside, if there is one? Is it just the difficulty of channeling them to one place then? Because obviously they won't be hungry, they won't have any reason to go to specific plots.
No, that's it. It's hard to kill deer that don't feel stress. If they're totally good, just hanging out, you know, in a condensed area, you know, they don't need to move and concentrate where the food is best, because there's food everywhere. There's no urgency. Without that sense of urgency and that stress, they're just a lot harder to kill.
But then on the plus side, as you're turning this from a primarily cattle farm to a whitetail focused property, that'll help them grow and be healthy and want to have a reason to come here.
Yeah, the deer that are here are going to be super healthy. And that was kind of what the whole experiment is going to be about here. We don't want tons of deer, we just want a manageable number of super healthy deer, and then just see what comes out of that. I've never been able to do that before because every place that I've owned or had access to manage had a really high deer density to start with, and it's just a constant war, you know, trying to keep the numbers down and, you know, fit into the neighborhood from a good neighbor standpoint with all the farmers around. And it was just, this place is better from that standpoint. We don't have that working against us to start. So as long as we keep our, the brakes on the population and we don't let there get too many deer here, it's going to be pretty easy, even in a bad year, to have enough food to keep them super healthy. Because ideally, you don't just feed them up until the season's over and then it's like, well, good luck, guys. Ideally you feed them all year round.
Right.
And it takes a few generations of deer when they're fed that well and they're that healthy. It's like, the first generation doesn't necessarily get it, but their fawns are like, they come out healthier. The does are healthier when they're lactating. Then that generation produces another generation that's even healthier. So it's really a couple of 2-3 generations deep before you really see the benefit. So maybe, again, I've always said this farm's about 3 years away. It's probably 2 to 3 years away of being just what it can potentially be.
And maybe this is a tangent, but I know last year you had a goal of killing X number of does. I don't think you ended up shooting as many as you wanted to. Do you think that that will work against you, or is there just so much food and the density is so low it won't really have that much of an impact?
Long term, it'll catch up if I can't get closer to my targets.
Right.
You know, because they're going to continue to hold up here.
Right.
The deer aren't going to leave here because there's so much food, you know.
Right.
So the neighbors, for the most part, are cattle farmers, so there's not a lot of places for them to go. And so the goal is 25% to 1/3, you know, 33%.
Buck to doe?
No, total harvest of adult deer.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So if we've got, let's say we did that aerial survey and there was 65 deer here. Let's say 30 of them. I'm going to say 30 plus of them were does. So so I got to kill somewhere between 8 and 10 to stay on that line. And then you're still going to get bucks. I mean, you're going to have, which is okay. I mean, we'll see what happens if we can flip the buck to doe ratio here. You know, the same way that we did in southern Iowa.
But that's probably a couple seasons down the line where you really start to worry about that too much.
Yeah, and I'm never going to worry about it.
Right.
That's when we'll start to see it, and it'll be kind of a curiosity of what happens. But I think by next year, if we continue to stay on the does, we'll definitely see a buck to doe ratio that's leaning pretty heavily in favor of bucks, even by next year.
I gotcha.
So that wraps up the soybeans. I mean, it's, you know, there's nothing really to say about it. They did so well this year that makes you like feel like, yeah, let's plant some more beans. Last year the deer just wiped them, and then the drought, they just didn't grow fast enough, and the deer just were able to stay ahead of them. And then this year the weather has been so perfect that the beans are outgrowing the browse pressure from the deer. So again, I don't want to rely on, you know, one data point and say, oh, beans are the thing. But I think we talked about mixing them with sorghum, and you know, there's a place for beans definitely on this farm. Next, we're going to talk about overseeding brassicas. I think it was 10 days ago, almost 2 weeks ago maybe, we went through and I broadcast the Whitetail Institute Winter Greens and a few other of their brassica blends. That was the main one, into some of the areas that like failed beans, or at least areas that the beans seemed like they were failing. Well, since then they've really filled in some of those spots. But here's one we're standing in that I did overseed this, and you can see that the amount of brassicas coming up is pretty low. They're gonna come up. I mean, the seed is there. We've had a couple of inches of rain in the last week, so they've probably got what they need to get going now. But then you compare that to the spots that I drilled during the same time, and there were 2 plots in particular that the beans had really been eaten down. I was talking about, you know, up on the ridges how the beans just get hammered. Well, rather than broadcasting into those, you know, there wasn't enough beans there to feel good about saving, so I just drilled right through them. Well, not only did that not destroy the beans, interestingly enough, the brassicas in those areas now are 3 inches tall because they went into the ground rather than got thrown out on top of the ground. And there was some moisture to start with, so the no-till drill, the PH Outdoors drill into the standing beans was a smashing success. Versus
Smashing Pumpkin success.
Yes, we've already established that we're going to have to do some smashing pumpkins and create our own rock band this fall. So I got distracted there.
Overseeding versus drilling.
Yes, drilling is way better, bottom line. Drill where you can. If you can't, the broadcasting will work, but you got to have perfect conditions to make it really kick off. And we had nearly perfect conditions, and it still is just in the stages of getting going, you know, 10 days to 2 weeks later, whereas the stuff that we drilled is, you know, it's way ahead. So that's kind of the takeaway on overseeding. We learned some things there that maybe we just confirmed some things that we learned last year. If you can find a drill cheap somewhere, or you can afford one of the PH drills, gosh, that's where it really pays off. It pays off when you're planting your beans in the spring, and it pays off when you're planting your brassicas in the fall. That no-till drill is a definite winner.
What is overseeding?
Overseeding the brassicas.
Right, what does that mean?
Throwing it over the top of something.
Oh, like broadcasting.
Broadcasting.
Oh, okay. I thought it meant like putting out way too much
No, we didn't do that.
Okay.
No.
Okay, that...
Yeah,
I've been just kind of...
Biting your tongue?
Yes. Okay, so it's like broadcasting over the top of something, not putting out like way too much seed.
Good clarification.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think we're good to move on to another topic. Takeaway, drilling is way better. So when Jordan flew this plot a little bit ago with the drone, she thought it was a cornfield. And that's why we're standing here. This is actually another one of my bean plots. We talked about volunteer corn last fall. We knew that the deer weren't going to eat all the corn in this valley. And then we knew also that corn is resistant to the same herbicides for the most part the beans are. You spray Roundup on beans, kills most everything but the beans. And we got a lot of water hemp this year, let's not talk about that. But the corn is also conditioned for the same herbicides. So you can't just wipe the corn out. But you can spray the corn with clethodim because it's a grass, and you should be able to remove it out of these beans. For some reason, the corn that I've got, the clethodim didn't kill it. Whether it was resistant or whether I just didn't spray the rate aggressively enough, I don't know. But I've got a bunch of corn here, and it's not looking that bad really. So I might just embrace this whole concept of volunteer corn in the future. When I see it pop up in spots that I've planted into beans, I'm just going to go ahead and hand broadcast urea nitrogen fertilizer into those areas and just encourage that corn.
Yeah, because what's the downside?
There is no real downside other than, in theory, if you have too much of something growing anywhere, nothing does well.
Right.
But you can see it, the beans are coming up through the corn just fine. The corn's doing fine. So, I don't see a problem in the future with maybe just embracing this volunteer corn whenever we have it and, just really, fertilizing it and encouraging it to grow better. So volunteer corn, I guess, is not bad. We're standing on the edge of a small clover plot here. I want to talk about my strategy with regard to clover. It's a huge element long term of creating one of these properties and making it flourish because it's available most of the year. There's a certain period in the winter when it's not there, but I mean all summer, all spring, early spring it greens up. It's a great source of protein for the deer, and putting it in small locations like this. This is probably 1/8 of an acre, maybe less than that. Putting several of these around the farm is going to be a key part of what I do long term here. And I've been planting the Whitetail Institute Imperial Whitetail Clover, and I've had really good success with that over the years. It's primarily a white clover, which is high in protein, and the deer really favor that. But anyway, I want to talk about management now. Normally, 1 or max 2 mowings should take care of the clover, but this year is just a little bit different with all the moisture and all the weeds. But clover loves fertilizer, so you got to do all the stuff that the soil test recommends. pH has got to be as neutral as possible. Lots of P and K. You need to keep the weeds out, keep it well fertilized. Just as a quick side note, I established this plot with broadcast seeding this spring. So that's a pretty nice stand of clover for just throwing some seed out on top of the ground a few months ago. I mean, great growing conditions for that this year. We've talked about that, but overall the performance of a broadcast seeding is really good in this spot. Behind me is a 10-foot tall wall of corn and Jordan. We've had really good success with the corn on the farm this year, and really last year it was good too. The deer don't seem to have a taste for the corn too much during the summer, and as it kind of proved out last year, they didn't have a huge taste for it in the fall or winter either.
Do you think that's because so much of the commercial ag in the area is corn, so they just have a massive amount of it? Yeah,
I think so. I don't think they're like quite as obsessed with it as they are in areas where maybe there's not as much food. But we do have 3 corn plots. This one's about 1.5 acres roughly. There's one up on the ridge that's probably 2 acres, thereabouts. And then just a little small one on the bench above the buildings that's less than 1/2 acre. But I'd be shocked if any one of those 3 gets cleaned out this fall. I mean, there's no way they're eating all the corn behind us. I mean, I don't know that there's a farmer out there that wouldn't claim this corn. I mean, that's 200 bushel per acre plus kind of production corn on this little valley. I guess that's one thing that's nice about reclaiming this old grassland is you've got, you know, some pretty good dirt to start with because it's had so many years in grass and cow manure, and it's not been depleted by farming. And then, you know, you work it down a little bit. We had brassicas in here, and that grew up tall in the spring, and we disked that in. I mean, this should have been some of the best dirt in this whole part of the state. And you know, we're seeing that with the production of the corn. So corn will play some role in the fall hunting strategy. I don't know exactly what yet. There's no trees around this plot. This is more of a spot where the deer get something to eat, you know, to keep them well fed and healthy through the winter. The other one on the bench above the buildings, I think could be an attraction. Pulling deer off the hills, you know, down around that field and then through that funnel. That field might play a role, and I think the one up on top will play a definite role because it's right next to a bedding area. And one thing I noticed that deer don't differentiate between corn and other kinds of cover. So if you leave the corn standing, they treat the edge between the corn and the timber as if they were still in the cover, still in the timber. So they move really freely during daylight on that edge between the corn and the trees. So I could see that being a spot for catching up with a mature buck, you know, early in the rut this fall. So that's corn. It plays a role, not as big of a role on this farm as what I'd expected, and maybe that will change without as many acorns this year. I mean, we did an acorn update already. There aren't near as many acorns, so they're not going to have quite as much just natural food sources as what they had last year. So they may rely a little bit more on what we planted. Any thoughts on corn?
Don't have any.
There's lots of it, I do know that. Okay, let's move on. We got one more topic to cover. We're up on the ridge. There's a field just outside of the open gate. And this was planted to beans originally. The deer hammered those beans. Half of the plot, or a little bit less, is in sorghum too, but the part I wanted to talk about was the side that was originally planted to beans. I came back about maybe, I bet it was 3 weeks, maybe almost a month ago, and I drilled the Whitetail Institute power plant into this. And you can see quite a bit of that in there. I was a little bit nervous that as hard as they were scalping the beans up here, that power plant wouldn't make it very far either, but there's tons of the peas. They've got a big, some kind of Austrian winter pea or a black-eyed pea or something in there, and that's what those bigger ones are, Jordan. They're peas from that power plant blend. So it actually filled it in pretty well. I'm impressed. I was a little bit nervous, like I said, that with the amount of pressure here that it wouldn't make it, but it's being productive and the deer are definitely taking advantage of it. So I don't use a lot of, I would say, non-core seed options I've mentioned earlier, and maybe I haven't, but my philosophy is just keep it real simple. Corn, beans, brassicas, clover, sorghum, that makes up the core, you know, of what I'm going to plant every year. And anything outside of that is more experimental, or just to see what happens, or maybe there's a little niche that you're trying to fill. But I do think after seeing this that I'm going to, you know, be a little bit more receptive to using the power plant more often in the future. We got so distracted filming the updates for the habitat segment that we forgot to film a close for the food plot part. So that's what I'm doing right now. It's probably 5 or 6 days later, and it's raining again, which, I mean, believe it or not, it was starting to get dry here, so we can use this. But what a perfect year. I think that this episode, you couldn't really look at it and say, these are the things that did well and these are the things that didn't, because everything did well. You know, the growing conditions were almost perfect. I can't imagine really better conditions for, growing a bumper crop of pretty much anything you wanted on a recreational farm. So I think the takeaways on this episode are more about the structure and the composition of what to plant rather than what worked and what didn't, because everything worked. The only thing that didn't, I guess you could say, is the deer just continue to scalp the beans in those small plots in the remote areas. So that's always going to be a tough one to manage around, but everything else did awesome. A couple of key takeaways: pumpkins around the edges of the food plots seems like a great idea. I'm going to continue to push for that. That's worked really well. I think planting sorghum into beans, get the beans established, clean them up, then plant the sorghum. That seems to make a lot of sense to me. I'm going to continue to pursue that, that possibility. And then the third one is just the volunteer corn and the fact that maybe it's not your enemy. So those are the things that maybe I pulled from, this review of the farm. Well, I appreciate you joining me. We'll see you right back here again soon for the next episode of Dream Farm. And remember to always dream big.